She was 9 years old when they told her she was lucky. Princess Isabella of Valois had skin like fresh cream, eyes that sparkled with childish wonder, and a smile that could melt the hardest hearts. But tonight, as she sits in her chamber, she doesn't know that tomorrow her childhood dies forever. The year is 1396. In the halls of the French royal court, little Isabella plays with her dolls, dreams of fairy tales, and believes in the goodness of adults. She has no idea that 800 miles away, a monster wearing a crown is already planning her destruction. A man whose very name makes grown knights weep in terror. Isabella learned to read before she could properly hold a sword. She devoured stories of brave princesses who married handsome princes and lived happily ever after. But the man chosen to be her husband, he wasn't from any fairy tale a child should ever read. Richard II of England, 60 years old, a man who had personally killed over 200 people in battle, a king who tortured prisoners for entertainment, a ruler who collected the teeth of his enemies and wore them as jewelry. And now he wanted a bride. While Isabella braided flowers into her hair, Richard was negotiating her purchase. Yes, purchase. Because in medieval politics, 9-year-old princesses weren't people. They were commodities. And Isabella was about to become the most expensive child ever sold. That night, Isabella made a wish on a falling star. She wished to meet a real prince, just like in her stories. She had no idea that her wish was about to come true, in the most horrifying way imaginable. The next morning, while Isabella played in her garden, her fate was being decided by men who had never spoken a single word to her. Her father, Charles VI, was going mad. Her uncles saw an opportunity, and Richard II of England had made an offer they couldn't refuse. The Princess Isabella, aged 9 years, to be delivered to His Majesty Richard II for the purpose of marriage and alliance, 9 years old. The contract that sealed her fate was signed before she even knew what marriage meant. While diplomats haggled over her dowry, Isabella was teaching her dolls how to have a proper wedding ceremony. She made them promise to love each other forever. She had no idea that in 3 months she would be walking down an aisle toward a man who had never learned what love meant. The messenger arrived on a Tuesday. He brought with him Richard's formal proposal, a chest of gold and something else. Something that would make Isabella's blood run cold. When she finally understood what it meant, Richard's engagement gift to Isabella wasn't flowers or jewels. It was a necklace made from the teeth of French soldiers he had personally killed in battle. Each tooth represented a life he had taken. Each bead was a father, a son, a brother who would never come home. And he expected a 9-year-old to wear it on their wedding day. When Isabella's governess explained what the necklace was made from, the child didn't speak for 3 days. She would hold the necklace and whisper apologies to the dead men. She was 9 years old, and already she was learning that the world was far more cruel than any fairy tale had prepared her for. The wedding dress arrived 6 weeks later. It weighed more than Isabella did. The seamstresses had to stuff the bodice with cotton batting to make it fit her 9-year-old chest. As she stood in that mirror, she looked less like a bride and more like a child about to be sacrificed. Richard had requested that their wedding feast be decorated with trophies from his military victories. When the French courtiers saw what arrived from England, many of them vomited. Human skulls polished to a shine, rib bones carved into decorative chalices. A 9-year-old's wedding reception looked like a scene from hell. On her last night in France, Isabella prayed for courage. She asked God to help her be a good wife, even though she had no idea what being a wife meant. She packed her favorite doll in her trunk, not knowing that Richard had specifically ordered that she bring no childish things to England. That doll would be confiscated the moment she stepped off the ship. As Isabella walked toward the ship that would take her to England, she turned back one last time to look at France. She was leaving behind everything she had ever known, everyone who had ever loved her, and the last remnants of her childhood. She would never see her homeland again. The cabin they prepared for Isabella's journey had been specially designed by Richard himself. It looked like a child's playroom, but the windows were barred, the door locked from the outside. and the walls were lined with silk to muffle any screams. Richard wanted to make sure his bride arrived in England, intact. During the crossing, a violent storm nearly sank the ship. Isabella spent 3 days in that locked cabin, seasick and terrified, with no one to comfort her except the doll she'd smuggled aboard. She sang herself lullabies to stay calm, the same songs her mother had sung to her. She didn't know those would be the last lullabies of her childhood. When the ship approached Dover, thousands of English subjects lined the shore. They had come to see the 9-year-old who would be their queen. What they saw emerging from that ship would haunt them for the rest of their lives. A child so small she had to be lifted down from the ship like a piece of cargo. Isabella's first step onto English soil was also her first step into a nightmare. The English nobles who greeted her had been specifically chosen by Richard, men who had proven their loyalty by participating in his most brutal military campaigns. These were not men who would protect a child. These were men who would deliver her to a monster. The carriage that carried Isabella to London had been used before to transport prisoners to the Tower of London for execution. Richard had chosen it deliberately. He wanted his bride to understand from the moment she arrived that she was not a guest in England. She was a prisoner. Richard had decided that Isabella would stay in the Tower of London until their wedding day. When the English nobles protested that the Tower was a prison, not a palace, Richard smiled and said, "Exactly. I want her to understand her situation completely before she becomes my wife." On Isabella's first night in the Tower, Richard sent her a letter. She couldn't read English yet, so she stared at the parchment for hours, trying to understand what it said. When a scribe finally translated it for her the next morning, Isabella's screams could be heard throughout the entire tower. What did that letter say? What training did Richard have planned for his 9-year-old bride? And why, despite everything you're about to hear, would Isabella eventually thank him for destroying her childhood? The answer lies in understanding the mind of a child who had to become something else, entirely to survive. But that transformation hadn't begun yet. In 3 days, she would meet her husband for the first time, and nothing could have prepared her for that moment. While Isabella wept in her tower cell, Richard II of England prepared for their first meeting. He had been studying her portrait for months, planning every detail of their encounter. At 60, he had outlived 3 wives, all of whom had died under mysterious circumstances. Now he wanted something different, something he could shape from the beginning. Richard had personally selected every piece of clothing Isabella would wear in England. No bright colours, only deep purples and blacks that matched his own preference for darkness. No comfortable fabrics, only heavy silks and velvets that would restrict her movement. He wanted her to understand immediately that even her body no longer belonged to her. Isabella hadn't eaten in 3 days. Every time servants brought food, she would stare at it and wonder if it was poisoned. At 9 years old, she was already learning the paranoia that would keep her alive in Richard's court. Trust no one. Eat nothing. Speak only when spoken to. These were not lessons any child should learn. At precisely noon on her 4th day in the tower, the door opened. Isabella had been expecting a servant with more untouched food. Instead, she saw the shadow of a man filling the doorway. Even without seeing his face, she knew this was him. This was the monster from her nightmares made real. Richard's smile was worse than any scowl. He had filed his teeth to points years ago to terrify enemies in battle. When he smiled at Isabella, she saw the mouth of a wolf pretending to be human. She would later tell her diary that in that moment, she knew she was going to die in England. Isabella tried to disappear into the stone wall. At 9 years old, she already understood that running would be useless. The tower had no escape. So she did what children do when faced with the impossible. She tried to become invisible. But Richard had come specifically to make sure she could never hide from him, so small. Richard whispered, his voice like gravel scraping stone, so very, very small. He knelt down until his face was level with Isabella's, and she could smell the wine and rotting meat on his breath. "But you'll grow," he said. running one scarred finger along her cheek. "I'll make sure you grow exactly as I need you to." When Richard took Isabella's hand, his fingers wrapped around her wrist twice. She stared at their joined hands and realized that he could break her arm without effort. He squeezed just hard enough to leave marks, not enough to damage his property, but enough to show her who owned her now. "Come," Richard commanded, lifting Isabella like she weighed nothing at all. "It's time for you to see your new home, your real home." Through the doorway, Isabella could see guards waiting, not to protect her, but to prevent any possibility of escape. The Tower of London had been just the beginning. Richard's palace was a museum of murder. Every tapestry showed him slaughtering enemies. Every weapon on the wall had taken lives. As he dragged Isabella through the halls, he pointed to each display with pride. "That sword killed 12 French knights at Poitiers," he would say. "This mace crushed the skull of a rebel lord." He was giving her a tour of death itself. Isabella's new bedroom was Richard's masterpiece of psychological torture. He had created a child's room designed by a monster's mind. Everything looked normal from a distance, but every detail was wrong. The dolls were dressed for funerals. The toys were painted with blood. Even the nursery rhymes embroidered on the pillows contained verses about death and war. "Sit," Richard commanded, patting the bed beside him. The word wasn't a request. It was the first lesson in absolute obedience. Isabella's feet wouldn't move. Every part of her 9-year-old mind was screaming that sitting on that bed would change something fundamental about who she was. She was right. Isabella took 7 steps toward that bed. Later, she would count them in her diary, 7 steps that carried her from childhood into something else entirely. With each step, she told herself that she was being brave. She didn't understand yet that what she was really doing was learning to disappear inside herself. "Good girl," Richard whispered, his hand heavy on her shoulder like a chain she could never break. "You learn quickly. That will make everything so much easier." Isabella sat perfectly still, afraid that any movement would trigger something terrible. She was learning Richard's first rule. Absolute stillness was the only safety. Richard opened a small box and showed Isabella her engagement present. It wasn't a ring for her finger. It was designed to lock around her neck. "This will help you remember who you belong to," he said, his voice sickeningly gentle. "It will remind you every moment of every day that you are mine to do with as I please." The collar locked with a soft click that echoed in Isabella's bones. It was lighter than she expected, but she could feel its weight with every breath. Richard held up a small silver key before tucking it into his robes. "This stays with me always," he said. "Just like you do now." When Isabella saw herself in the mirror, she understood what Richard had done. He hadn't just put jewelry on her. He had marked her as his property in a way that everyone could see but no one could question. The collar looked like a beautiful necklace, but Isabella could feel the truth of what it really was with every heartbeat. Richard's reflection smiled behind Isabella's in the mirror. He had achieved what he wanted, not a wife, but a perfectly controlled possession. "Beautiful," he whispered in her ear. "You're going to be so very beautiful when I'm finished training you." Isabella didn't understand what he meant by training, but she was about to find out. Richard had prepared a daily schedule for Isabella's education. What he showed her wasn't lessons in languages or mathematics. It was a systematic program designed to break her spirit and rebuild her as the perfect victim. Each day would strip away another piece of the child she had been. Isabella couldn't read all the words on the schedule, but she understood enough to know that her life was about to become something unimaginable. As she struggled to pronounce submission training, Richard watched her like a cat watching a mouse. He was enjoying her confusion, her fear, her complete helplessness. As the sun set on Isabella's first day as Richard's bride, she sat alone in her corrupted bedroom, trying to understand what was happening to her. The collar around her neck caught the dying light like a chain made of fire. In 12 hours, Richard would return to begin her education. She had no idea what horrors awaited her, but her body already knew to be afraid. That night, Isabella wrote in her diary for the last time as a child. Her words were simple, innocent, heartbreaking. She still believed that God would protect her, that being brave would be enough. She had no idea that Richard's training was designed to teach her that God wasn't coming, and that being brave would only make her suffering last longer. Isabella didn't sleep that night. How could she? Tomorrow would bring the beginning of Richard's training program. Lessons no child should ever learn, in subjects no innocent mind should ever study. She lay awake wondering what submission training meant, not knowing that the answer would change her forever. In 8 hours, Richard would return. In 8 hours, Isabella's real education would begin. And in 8 hours, she would learn why Richard had chosen a 9-year-old bride instead of a grown woman. The answer lies in understanding what happened during her first submission training session, a lesson so horrific that it would teach Isabella something she never expected to learn: how to thank her tormentor for teaching her to survive. But first, she had to live through the training itself. Isabella counted every hour until dawn. 7 hours, 53 minutes, and 12 seconds of waiting for her nightmare to begin in earnest. She had tried to pray, but the words felt hollow in a room designed by a monster. When the first grey light crept through her window, she knew her childhood had exactly 1 hour left to live. While Isabella trembled in her room, Richard prepared for their first session in his private study. The books on his desk weren't about ruling kingdoms, they were about breaking human spirits. Richard had spent decades studying not just how to kill enemies, but how to destroy their minds first. Now he would apply those techniques to a 9-year-old child. The footsteps stopped outside Isabella's door. For 30 seconds, complete silence. Then she saw it, an eye pressed to the keyhole, watching her like a hawk studies a mouse. Richard was learning her habits, her fears, her reactions. Even her terror was data he would use against her. When Richard entered, Isabella knew immediately that something fundamental had changed. Yesterday, he had pretended to be human. Today, he had dropped the mask entirely. The leather case in his hands contained what he called his teaching tools, instruments designed not to kill, but to teach through pain what words could never convey. Richard opened the case like a physician preparing for surgery. Each instrument had been chosen for a specific purpose, not to cause permanent damage, but to teach lessons that words alone could never impart. Education, Richard explained softly, requires the proper tools. Today, you learn what obedience really means. Isabella tried to make herself small enough to disappear, but there was nowhere to hide in the room Richard had designed as her prison. At 9 years old, she was about to learn that some adults were capable of evil that no child's mind should ever have to understand. At the first lesson, Richard said, his voice gentle as poison, is about trust. You're going to learn to trust me completely, even when every instinct tells you to run. Especially then. His hands moved toward Isabella's face, and she understood that her real education was about to begin. When Richard touched the collar, Isabella felt something click inside the mechanism. Suddenly it was tighter, pressing against her throat just enough to make breathing difficult. This collar has 7 settings, Richard explained clinically. Today we explore setting number 2. If you please me, it loosens. If you disobey, well, you'll learn. Isabella clawed at the collar, her child's fingers finding nothing but smooth metal and locked mechanisms. Richard observed her panic with the detached interest of a natural philosopher, studying a specimen. Lesson 1, he said calmly. Your comfort, your pain, your very breath, all of it belongs to me now. The key to Isabella's collar glinted in Richard's palm, like a star she could never reach. Ask me nicely, he commanded, watching her struggle to breathe. Ask your husband to allow you to breathe easily. This was the moment Isabella realized that even her survival depended on learning to beg. But please, Isabella whispered, the word barely audible through her constricted throat. It was the first time in her 9 years of life that she had ever begged for something as basic as the right to breathe. Richard smiled at the sound. He was teaching her to ask permission for everything, even life itself. The collar loosened with a soft click. and Isabella gulped air like a drowning person reaching the surface. But Richard's hand remained on the mechanism, his message clear. This relief was a gift that could be revoked instantly.
"Good girl," he whispered.
"You're learning that I control everything,
"Even whether you live or die."
Richard unfolded a new schedule, not the simple one he had shown her yesterday, but the complete curriculum for her destruction. Today's lesson was about breathing, he explained, his voice terrifyingly calm. Tomorrow we learn about eating. Next week we explore sleeping. By our wedding day, you'll understand that every function of your body happens only by my permission. The schedule read like a medical textbook written by a demon. Each week would strip away another basic human right until Isabella understood that her very existence depended entirely on Richard's whims. This wasn't cruelty, it was systematic. Psychological engineering designed to create the perfect victim. Isabella's 9-year-old mind couldn't grasp the full horror of what Richard was explaining, but her body knew. Every cell in her small frame
screamed that she was in the presence of something inhuman.
She was watching her own innocence die piece by piece, and there was nothing she could do to save it. Richard packed his tools with the care of a craftsman proud of his work. Today had been successful. Isabella was learning that resistance was futile, that her survival depended on absolute submission. "Tomorrow," he said, closing the case, "we begin your lessons in gratitude. You'll learn to thank me for everything I do to you." When the door closed, Isabella remained frozen exactly where Richard had left her. She was afraid that moving might be interpreted as disobedience, afraid that breathing too deeply might trigger the collar, afraid that thinking the wrong thoughts might somehow summon him back. Fear was becoming her entire world. When Isabella caught sight of her reflection in the window, she didn't recognize the child staring back at her. The girl in the glass had older eyes, careful movements, and a hunched posture that spoke of someone learning to make herself invisible. In one morning, Richard had aged her by years. Isabella's fingers traced the collar with something approaching gratitude, not because she wanted to wear it, but because touching it reminded her that she was still alive, still breathing, still surviving. Richard was teaching her to be grateful for the chains that bound her.
And the lesson was working.
Isabella approached her breakfast tray not with hunger, but with the careful calculation of someone learning the rules of survival. Each bite was taken not for nourishment, but because Richard might test her obedience later. She was learning to eat like a prisoner, not a child. Isabella opened her diary, but the words that came out were different from the innocent prayers of yesterday. "The king is teaching me important lessons," she wrote in her child's handwriting. "I must be grateful for his patience with me." She was already learning to lie to herself. The words in Isabella's diary that day would haunt historians for centuries. A 9-year-old child was already internalizing her abuser's logic, already believing that her suffering was her own fault,
already expressing gratitude for the cruels that kept her alive.
This is how the human mind protects itself from unbearable truth. Isabella hid her diary with the careful movements of someone who understood that even her private thoughts were dangerous. She was learning to live like a shadow, to breathe like a whisper, to exist without existing. Richard's first lesson had been brutally effective. As noon approached, Isabella sat in the harsh light streaming through her window,
reading and rereading tomorrow's schedule.
Food dependency training would begin at dawn. She didn't understand what it meant, but her stomach already ached with dread. How do you teach a child to be grateful for starvation? Richard was about to show her. And the most terrifying part, by the end of that lesson, Isabella would genuinely thank him for it. Isabella hadn't eaten in 36 hours, not because food wasn't available, but because yesterday's schedule had included a note in Richard's handwriting. No food until lesson completion. She sat in the darkness, her empty stomach cramping with hunger, learning that even basic survival was a privilege Richard could grant or deny. Richard had studied the science of starvation with the same precision he once applied to siege warfare. He knew exactly how long to withhold food before a child's mind would begin to break.
Exactly when desperation would transform into gratitude.
Today, Isabella would learn to thank him for the privilege of eating. When Richard entered carrying that simple bowl of gruel, Isabella's body responded before her mind could stop it. Her mouth watered, her stomach clenched with desperate need, her entire being focused on that single bowl of thin porridge. This was exactly what Richard had planned, her body becoming his ally against her will. Richard held the bowl 18 inches from Isabella's face, close enough for her to smell the warm grain, far enough that she couldn't reach it without his permission.
Tell me, he said softly, well, what do you want?
It was a simple question with a devastating answer. She wanted to live.
And he controlled whether she could. Please, Your Majesty, may I eat?
The words fell from Isabella's lips like stones into a deep well. She had never begged for anything in her 9 years of royal life, but hunger was teaching her that pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. Richard smiled at the sound of her desperation. Richard wanted more than begging. He wanted gratitude. Isabella's starving mind struggled to understand. How do you thank someone for ending the suffering they caused? But Richard waited patiently, the bowl warming his hands while her stomach ate itself with hunger. He had all the time in the world. She didn't. Thank you for letting me eat. The words escaped, Isabella's lips like a confession of sins. She didn't understand she was committing. Richard's smile broadened with each syllable, his psychological masterpiece taking shape. He was teaching her that survival itself was a gift he graciously provided. When Richard finally released his grip on the bowl, Isabella understood the lesson completely.
Even holding food was something
she did only by his permission. The gruel was thin and tasteless, peasant food that she would have rejected in disgust just 3 days ago. Today it was salvation. Isabella raised the spoon halfway to her mouth before stopping to look at Richard for permission. In 3 days, he had trained her to seek approval for the most basic human functions. When he nodded, she ate that first spoonful like it was communion wine, sacred.
necessary, granted only by divine mercy.
Isabella wept as she ate, but these weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of gratitude. So overwhelming they felt like physical pain. Her starved body was flooding with relief, and her mind was making a connection that would define the rest of her life. Richard equals survival.
Pain followed by mercy creates love.
When Isabella finished eating, she looked at Richard with eyes that held something new. Not love, but something more dangerous, dependency. He had starved her to the breaking point, then rescued her from the suffering he caused. Her traumatized mind was beginning to see him as savior rather than destroyer. Richard stroked Isabella's hair with false tenderness, and this time she didn't flinch away. Her body had learned a new equation. Richard's touch preceded relief from suffering. He was programming her responses with scientific precision, and the programming was working exactly as planned. "Thank you, Your Majesty, for taking care of me." The words flowed from Isabella's lips like a natural spring, no longer extracted by force but given freely. In 3 days, Richard had convinced a child to be grateful for the very abuse that was destroying her. This is how Stockholm Syndrome begins. When Richard produced that small crust of bread, Isabella's face lit up like sunrise. She didn't see it as the meager scrap it was, but as evidence of his continuing generosity. Richard was teaching her that every small mercy was proof of his essential goodness, not understanding that intermittent reinforcement creates the strongest psychological bonds. Isabella broke that bread crust into 12 tiny pieces, eating each one slowly, reverently, like a religious ritual. She was learning to find infinite gratitude in finite mercies, to see abundance in scarcity. Richard watched her, with the pride of an artist whose masterpiece was finally taking shape. That evening, Isabella wrote in her diary with words that would chill historians for centuries to come. She was genuinely grateful for Richard's kindness in starving her, honestly appreciating his wisdom in controlling her food. A 9-year-old child was learning to love her chains. Every movement Isabella made was now calculated for Richard's approval. She sat straighter, spoke softer, moved more carefully. She was becoming the perfect prisoner, one who required no guards, because she guarded herself, no chains because she had internalized the locks. Isabella's fingers traced the collar with something approaching affection. It was no longer just a restraint. It was her connection to Richard, her reminder that she belonged to someone who cared enough to control
her completely.
She was learning to love her chains because they connected her to her survival. As Richard prepared to leave, Isabella looked at him with eyes that held desperate attachment. Not love, she was too young and too traumatized for love, but something more dangerous, complete dependency. She needed him now, not just physically, but psychologically, and they both knew it. After Richard left, Isabella sat alone in her room. But she was no longer the same child who had arrived from France 5 days ago.
That child had dreams of escape, hope of rescue, faith in justice.
This child had learned that survival meant gratitude, that mercy came only through submission, that love was just another word for perfect control. Isabella's face in the candlelight showed neither happiness nor despair, but something more disturbing, acceptance. She had learned the most dangerous lesson of all, that fighting was pointless, that gratitude was survival, that thanking your torturer was the price of continued existence. But Richard's training was far from over. Tomorrow's schedule no longer filled Isabella with terror. It filled her with resigned acceptance. Sleep deprivation training would teach her that even rest was a gift from Richard. That unconsciousness itself was something she earned through perfect obedience. Her psychological destruction was proceeding exactly as planned. As Isabella prepared for bed, she found herself actually looking forward to tomorrow's lesson, not because she enjoyed suffering, but because successfully completing Richard's training meant earning his approval,
His mercy.
his continued kindness. She was learning to be grateful for the opportunity to be broken.
Piece by piece.
And in 2 weeks, when Richard asked her to marry him, she would thank him for that too.
The most terrifying part?
She would mean it. 2 weeks of Richard's education had transformed Isabella into something that chilled even the hardened servants. She sat before her mirror on her wedding morning, applying rouge to her pale cheeks with the mechanical precision of someone who had learned that her appearance belonged to Richard, not herself. The child who had arrived from France was gone forever. Isabella fastened her collar with the reverence of a bride, putting on her grandmother's pearls. Richard had decorated it for the wedding, transforming her shackles into what looked like the finest jewelry. She saw it as proof of his thoughtfulness, not understanding that even her wedding decorations were instruments of control. The wedding dress fit perfectly now, not because it had been altered, but because Isabella's body had been altered by weeks of controlled starvation and stress. The servants who dressed her worked in horrified silence, unable to meet the eyes of the child, who thanked them for participating in her own destruction. Westminster Abbey had hosted many royal weddings, but never one like this. The congregation looked like mourners rather than celebrants. English nobles, who had witnessed the bloodiest battles, wept openly as they watched a child walk toward her doom. This wasn't a wedding. It was a public execution of innocence. Richard wore his finest robes for the wedding. Robes, decorated with trophies from his military campaigns. The guests could see human teeth woven into his crown, could smell the leather made from enemy skin. He was a monster dressed as a king, and he made no attempt to hide what he was. When Isabella curtsied to Richard at the altar, witnesses later reported that what terrified them
most wasn't her fear, it was her gratitude.
She looked at Richard with the devotion of someone who genuinely believed he had saved her from something worse. She had been conditioned to see her destroyer as her rescuer. The priest's voice shook as he spoke the ancient words, his hands trembling with horror at what he was being forced to consecrate. When he asked Isabella if she took Richard as her lawfully wedded husband, the entire abbey held its breath. Her answer would haunt everyone present for the rest of their lives. I do with all my heart, and I thank you for choosing me. Isabella's words rang through the abbey like a death knell. She wasn't just accepting her fate, she was genuinely grateful for it. Richard had achieved something more horrific than forcing submission. He had created genuine gratitude for abuse. The wedding ring was connected by a golden chain to Richard's own ring, physically binding them together for the ceremony and beyond. Isabella gazed at the chain with wonder, seeing it as proof that Richard wanted to be connected to her always. She couldn't understand that it was just another leash. When Richard kissed his 9-year-old bride, witnesses reported that Isabella didn't flinch, didn't resist, didn't show any sign of distress. Instead, she leaned into the kiss like a flower turning toward sunlight. Richard had taught her to find joy in her own violation, and the lesson had taken completely. The wedding feast was decorated with Richard's collection of human remains, turning the celebration into a macabre museum of murder. Isabella sat beside her new husband, thanking him politely for each morsel he allowed her to eat, her perfect manners making the scene even more disturbing. Isabella entered her wedding night chamber with the calm acceptance of someone who had learned that pain was love, that control was care, that surrender was the highest form of devotion. Richard had created not just a victim, but a victim who craved her own victimization. Isabella knelt in prayer on her wedding night, but her words would have horrified any priest who heard them. She thanked God for blessing her with such a loving husband, praised Richard's kindness in teaching her proper obedience. Her faith itself had been weaponized against her. In the months that followed, Isabella became Richard's perfect wife, obedient, grateful, devoted, and completely hollow inside. She smiled when he entered a room, thanked him for every meal, every dress, every moment of his attention. She had become everything he wanted, a beautiful, broken doll that called its brokenness love. Isabella's later diary entries read like the confessions of someone completely brainwashed. She genuinely believed Richard was improving her character, genuinely felt grateful for his corrections, genuinely saw herself as fortunate to be chosen for such careful guidance. The child who had existed before was utterly gone.
Richard displayed Isabella to visitors like a prized artwork,
proof of his power to reshape human nature itself. She performed perfectly, by gracious, grateful, utterly devoted, and the visitors left with chills running down their spines. They had witnessed the complete psychological murder of a child's soul. Sometimes, when Isabella thought no one was watching, something would flicker behind her eyes, a ghost of the child she had been, a shadow of the woman she might have become. But these moments passed quickly, smothered by years of conditioning that taught her such thoughts were selfish,
ungrateful, wrong.
The historical record of Isabella's marriage survives in medieval chronicles, court documents, and witness testimonies that struggle to describe what they saw. One chronicler wrote, "The child queen thanked her husband for mercies that were cruelties, and called her chains jewelry. God help her corrupted soul." When Richard lay dying 7 years later, Isabella's reaction horrified the court. She didn't celebrate her approaching freedom. She panicked at the thought of losing her protector. She begged the doctors to save him, wept at his bedside, and when he died, she mourned him like a loving wife rather than a freed prisoner. At Richard's funeral, Isabella wept real tears for the man who had destroyed her childhood. She spoke of his kindness, his patience, his love. Even death couldn't break the chains he had forged in her mind. He had achieved the ultimate victory, his victim mourning him as a beloved husband. Isabella never recovered from Richard's conditioning. She lived the rest of her life seeking the security of absolute control,
never understanding that what she missed
wasn't love but the familiar chains that had defined her existence. She died at 35, still grateful to a ghost for destroying her life. Modern psychologists studying Isabella's case recognize it as perhaps the most complete example of Stockholm Syndrome in historical record. Richard had unknowingly developed techniques that wouldn't be formally understood until centuries later. Intermittent reinforcement, trauma bonding, learned helplessness, and complete psychological dependency. The most chilling evidence comes from Isabella's own writings in adulthood. She genuinely believed Richard
had given her a gift, the ability to find
profound gratitude in the smallest mercies. She saw her conditioning not as abuse but as education. her trauma not as damage but as improvement. The victim had become the perfect advocate for her victimization. Today, Isabella's collar sits in a museum labeled as medieval wedding jewelry. Tourists admire its craftsmanship without understanding. They're looking at an
Instrument of psychological torture, so effective that its victim loved it until
her dying day. History has forgotten the horror and remembered only the beauty. Isabella's story teaches us the most terrifying truth about human
psychology. Given enough time,
enough control, and enough intermittent mercy, any victim can be taught to love their victimizer. She thanked Richard, not because she was forced to, but because he had successfully convinced her that her suffering was love, her chains were jewelry, and her destruction was salvation. The 9-year-old princess who arrived in England died that first
night in the tower. What survived was something else entirely,
a perfect victim who called her victimization happiness.
and meant every word of gratitude she spoke.
This is why Isabella thanked Richard, because he had murdered her soul so completely that she was grateful for the knife.